Welcome to Liddypod, Beatles banter with Bedford and Beesley.
So Dave, here we are, episode 2 of Liddypod. Who would have thought?
Well, obviously not our listeners. In spite of the advice we've had, we've decided to carry on in spite of public opinion.
Yeah, despite all of those messages that we got, no, we're still here. We're doing the number 2. And for those people who enjoyed the first episode, thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you very much. Thank you for the feedback as well. It's been great.
Yeah, it has been really good, and we had loads of nice, positive comments. And if you've got a negative one, please, by all means, send them in. You know, we want to hear them all. And Dave, we are now accessible on lots of different platforms as well.
Oh yeah, absolutely. We decided because somebody said we'd love to see some film footage or where you're talking about. So we've now got a YouTube channel under Liddypod, and so you can hear the audio podcast, but we've put some photos to it. So the places we were talking about down by the docks, etc. in the first episode, there's some photos there, so you can listen and you can watch as well. And you never know. We might even film something in the future.
We may well. We got some little ideas up our sleeve. And photos for this particular episode are going to be important as well, aren't they, Dave? Tell us about this episode.
Well, we thought we'd go and pick a favourite place of mine, which is the Dingle, which is where I'm from. And of course, the person most famously connected with the Dingle is Ringo Starr. And you may well have seen over the last few years, there's been a lot of development and redevelopment and chaos and government inquiries and all sorts about Ringo's birthplace. The area is being transformed, as you will hear as we go through the programme, so you'll probably want to see what state that's up to, so we'll be posting some photos there so you can actually see where we're talking about the transformation that is happening at the moment.
Okay, because our next episode, we'll tell you more about that later. That's going to be a little different one, the next one. But the next 4, so to speak, we're going to be looking at each of the individual Beatles in terms of their childhood and growing up in Liverpool. And today, Dave, we're starting with Ringo.
Yeah, young Richie Starkey, the oldest of the Fab Four. He was born 7th of July 1940, so he's 3 months older than John, making him the eldest statesman, even though he was the last to join.
And we went out onto the streets exactly where Ringo was brought up.
You're listening to Liddypod, Beatles banter with Bedford and Beesley.
So Dave, we've come out into an area of the city known as the Dingle. And we're standing at the end of Madryn Street, and we'll explain that in a moment. But just before we get there, we're looking today at Ringo and his early life in Liverpool. But just tell us about the geography of the area, first of all.
Well, the Dingle is a small area in an overall place called Toxteth. Historically, it was called Toxteth Park, which goes back to the time of the Doomsday Book and everything. But local people refer to their own part of the area. They never refer to it as Toxteth, so it's always been known as the Dingle. And this is where I grew up, so I knew this area really well. And Toxteth was only really starting to be mentioned in 1981 after the street riots we mentioned in the last episode. The media latched onto the word Toxteth, and that was it. But we've never referred to it as such. So the Dingle is this part of a larger area called Toxteth, referred to and known as the Dingle. And yeah, this is where Ringo was born, where he grew up, and where he lived until the Beatles went down to London in the summer of '63.
So this area was Liverpool to Ringo. He didn't really move away from here. But we're standing at the end of Madryn Street. Tell us the house that we're focusing on.
Okay, so from the High Park Street end, we're looking down 5 houses down on the left to number 9 Madryn Street. Like all the houses around it, it's undergone a lot of renovation, and we'll mention that in just a moment. But the house where he was born, number 9 Madryn Street, had 3 bedrooms upstairs, 2 rooms downstairs. You've got a living room at the front and a kitchen cum dining room at the back. So there's no bathroom and there's no toilet actually in the house. The toilet was in a small brick outhouse at the bottom of the yard. To have a bath, you've got 2 options. One, what most people had was a big tin bath, and it would hang on a nail in the backyard. And on bath night, it was that rare it actually had its own name. You would bring the tin bath in, put it in front of the fire, fill it with your hot water, and everybody got their bath. Not so bad for Ringo as an only child, but imagine for someone like George Harrison, who was the youngest of 4, taking your turn in a bath. You're probably cleaner getting in than getting out.
Now you just mentioned that he was born in the house. I mean, how normal was that to be born at home?
I think for working class families, it was quite common. It's like happened with George as well. He was born at home, whereas John was born Oxford Street Maternity Hospital. Paul had the added advantage because his mum worked in the hospital, so that was fair enough. But yeah, that's quite a normal thing to be born at home.
And I suppose this was before the creation of the National Health Service as well, wasn't it, in 1948? So.
Yeah, exactly. So yeah, brave women, wonderful.
So that, I mean, looking down the road, and we can maybe post some photographs of the condition of the road today on the website. We'll give the website details later, but just tell us about the life and the time that Ringo would have had at this house.
Well, it's a lovely area, the Dingle. I had many happy memories here. My oldest friends actually from Madryn Street. My house. If you go to the bottom of Madryn Street, turn right, go about 20 yards, that was my back gate. So this was home to me. And yeah, it was a poor neighbourhood, very working class neighbourhood. Everybody's houses were the same, no bathroom, no toilet thing, but that didn't matter because you just got on with it. So it was a happy place, it was a good place for him to grow up. But of course, the tragic part to his life is that at the age of only 3, his mum and dad separated. Now, initially his dad, Richie Senior, moved out. I went to the very bottom house on the same side of Madryn Street, number 59, because that's where Ringo's grandparents lived. After that, he left the city. So at the age of 3, Ringo, I think, only ever saw his dad once, maybe twice, at a family funeral. That was it. So he was out of his life. So there was just him and his mum, Elsie. And God love her, she had to do at least 2 jobs at a time just to make the rent on the house.
Now, I understand that Ringo moved from this house. Was the fact that his mum and dad split up one of the reasons that he moved away from this house?
Oh yeah, it's one of the main reasons, definitely. Because of course you've got a 3-bedroomed house and there's just the 2 of them in there, and the rent's high, and so she's doing the 2 jobs, and it made more sense to move to somewhere smaller. So because all these houses were rented from local authority, best thing to do is you go down, put yourself on the list and say, I've got a bigger house, I need a smaller house. So what they did is they found a family who were living in a 2-bedroom house nearby who needed a bigger house, and they swapped houses.
It's quite literally just swapped houses.
That's what they did. They swapped houses.
And when you talk about local authority housing, for our overseas listeners, they'll often hear the term council housing. Is that the same thing?
It's the same thing, yeah. We refer to them as council houses. So it's the local council, the local government. They have supposedly the care and oversight of all these houses, and you paid your rent to the local council.
Okay, so should we take a little walk? Is it too far? Is it far away, the house that Ringo moved to?
Nah, it's only across the road. So he was here till he was about 5 years old, and literally just crossed over Hyde Park Street and went down to Admiral Grove.
Great, let's go over there. So Dave, we've walked just a couple of 100 metres across the road from Madryn Street, and we're in Admiral Grove. Tell us about the house that we're standing outside of.
So this is number 10 Admiral Grove. So this is where Ringo and his mum Elsie moved. Say little Richie, as he was then, was about 5 years old when they moved into here. And it's a smaller property to Madryn Street, so there's only 2 bedrooms here. But it meant the rent was cheaper. So Elsie was still doing 2 jobs, but it just wasn't as expensive to be paying out the rent like it was with 9 Madryn Street.
And again, for our overseas visitors, this is the type of house that we'd refer to as terraced housing in Liverpool. Where again, we'll post some photographs, but just explain the setup of these houses.
Yeah, terraced houses. It's a row of houses joined together. So each side of the street, same with Madryn Street. All the houses are connected.
Okay, so Ringo moved here in 1945, and this is where he stayed.
Yes, yeah, stayed here until the Beatles went down to London in '63. So it was a small house, and yes, because all the houses are joined together, when he decided to become a drummer, which we'll mention in a moment, couldn't really practice much at home because that would pass straight through to the next door neighbour's house, which in some ways was okay on one side, because at number 11 right next door to him was Eddie Miles, who used the name Eddie Clayton, and Ringo's first group was the Eddie Clayton Skiffle Group. So I'm sure Eddie wouldn't mind, but I think the rest of the neighbours, nah, they wouldn't like the drumming, I'm afraid.
So Ringo lived here from around about the age of 5. What was his childhood like in terms of living from that point onwards?
It did a bit of a troubled childhood, really, from a health point of view. So when he was just about to turn 7, he got rushed into hospital because his appendix burst, and he got peritonitis, which is, almost lethal for a lot of people. He ended up in a coma. At least 3 or 4 occasions his mum was called to come down because they didn't think he'd make it through the night. So he was very poorly at that time. But he did recover, but he missed a good 12 months of school. And that, when at the age of 7 going on 8, is quite crucial to your education. So he missed quite a bit of schooling. He recovered okay from that. Didn't get put in for the 11 plus exam. And of course the 11 plus, if you passed it, you went to a grammar school. If you didn't, you went to a secondary modern. There was no point putting Ringo in for the 11 plus. He would never have passed it. So he went from St Silas, which we'll mention in a moment, and he went on to Dingle Vale at the age of 11. And you think, that's good. Time to settle down. And his mum decided to settle down again as well, which was good. She met a lovely guy called Harry Graves. He was from Romford in Essex, but had moved up here, was a painter and decorator. He actually lived just off Park Road in Jacob Street, so not too far from here. And so Elsie married Harry, and he was a lovely guy, and Ringo loved the bones of him. He was a lovely, lovely fella. So I thought, great, stability. And then Ringo falls ill again. Now, he doesn't like sort of minor illnesses. He goes for life-threatening at every occasion. And so this time he went for tuberculosis. And of course TB, it was still a killer back then. It can be an absolute nightmare. So he had to recover. They put him in Royal Liverpool Children's Hospital, but they got a separate wing on the Wirral, the opposite side to the River Mersey. The part where Ringo was looking out over North Wales and the Dee estuary, so the quality of the air was good. So that was better for the children, for their lungs, to try and rebuild them. So again, he misses about 18 months of school. I think, in fact, the funny story is, when he got out of hospital, he was ready to leave school, and you'd have to get your certificate to say you'd attended, and they couldn't find Ringo's details because he'd been missing the last 18 months. By lovely coincidence, once he became famous, they could actually tell you the exact desk that he sat at. Isn't that, that's lovely, isn't it? And it's, again, one of those funny things with the Beatles around me all my life. I'm chair of governors at Dovedale School, which is where George were at school. When we get together for our meetings as the different chairs of governors, the building we meet in is the old Dingle Vale Secondary Modern School. So I actually sit in the classroom where Ringo occasionally went to school. I swear it's the exact spot where he sat. Definitely. As if I'd told a lie.
So Dave, this is the house that became Liverpool from 1945 onwards. We're going to take a walk up the road now to the school, because literally it is just a couple of 100 metres away, isn't it? There is primary school.
Yeah, it's primary school, St Silas. As we always say, one of the most famous Beatle people in the world went to St Silas, and that of course is me. Oh yeah, and Ringo. Yeah. And it's still one of the worst things. I was doing a Beatles tour a few years back, and I mentioned we go past St Silas. So that's the school that I went to, and that Ringo had gone to. And somebody said, "Did you go to school with Ringo?" He's 25 years older than me, and I still haven't worked out whether that's a compliment to Ringo and an insult to me, or a mixture of the two.
Come on, let's go reminisce for you as well. We go up to St Silas's. So Dave, we've walked again just a couple of 100 yards up the road, and we can't be any more than 2-3 minutes walk away from Madryn Street, but we're outside St Silas's Church of England primary schools, and this is the primary school that Ringo went to?
Yeah, it's a primary school. The equivalent in America is elementary school. So you're talking from the age of 4, and you go through to 11 when you then go to high school. So yeah, the original buildings have gone. They actually came down when I was at school here. That is only a coincidence. I had nothing to do with it. I did intend to knock it down, the original, honestly. But yeah, it's a newer building now. But this was the school that Ringo came to. from the age of 4 through to 11. But he's not the only famous Beatle person to have come here.
Yeah.
Because when I was doing the research, I was updating the Liverpool book. I was just going through some of the old school records, etc. And I realised that Alf Lennon had attended St Silas as well.
That's interesting.
Yeah, because about quarter of a mile from where we are now is where Alf Lennon was born.
Right.
And where he came back to live later on down in Copperfield Street. And so he actually started attending St Silas, and he was there until his father died, when his mum then couldn't afford to look after all the children, so Alf and his sister went up to Bluecoat School up near Penny Lane. But those first 2 or 3 years, Alf Lennon came to St Silas School as well.
That's fascinating. Now you say these are more modern buildings, and you can see that looking at them. So tell us what the old school was like. What was the type of school that Ringo would have been to here?
Well, it's what you see is your typical Victorian school building. So it looked dark, it looked slightly gothic, and I suppose it's meant just to scare us, I'm sure, which it did sometimes. So again, the brick buildings, the high ceiling, freezing cold in winter. But you know, it was nice. But you could tell when I was there in the 70s, it was struggling with damp and cold and stuff, and that's why they said no, they're gonna have to pull it down. Yeah. So they moved us out for 12 months.
So we've got a picture here of Ringo. He's brought up in a difficult area in some sense, poor area. Moved house, was very ill. Went to schools which are very close by. Where was the point at which he started to get an interest in drumming?
Well, funnily enough, that was while he was in hospital on the second occasion, when he was over in the Heswell area of the Children's Hospital. So he's what, 13, 14 years of age over there. And of course, there's a load of kids in there, and most of them, because their lungs are being attacked by the TB, were spending a lot of the time in bed. So they wheel them outside, they sit them in the fresh air, and you'd have a school teacher would come around, do some lessons with them. And of course, when you're 13 or 14, you really want to listen to a school teacher, don't you? No. But the interest that young Ringo got was when the music teacher would come round and would do songs with them and hand out the instruments. And he'd always had this thing about drums. So he said he would only take part if he could play the drum. And it sort of became a little obsession for him. Now, one of his childhood friends was Maddie Maguire. I did a lovely interview with her in Liverpool, because she and her mum lived opposite the Madryn Street house where Ringo was born. Well, she used to visit Ringo in the hospital, and obviously he told her all about his obsession with drums. So she bought him a record, Bedtime for Drums, and he would play it over and over, and it really became his obsession. So when his mum and her new husband, Ringo's stepfather, or his stepladder as Ringo referred to him, when they came to visit, it was obvious the drum thing was just massive in his life. So Harry said to him, well, I'll tell you what, when you come out of hospital, I will get you a drum kit. And God love him, he did exactly that. And so really, it was being in hospital gave him that drive and that passion for playing the drums.
I was about to say, it's ironic, isn't it, that the illness and enforced bed rest, or whatever it would have been termed at the time, actually resulted in him getting that initial contact with and interest in drumming, and then Mary, took that on, and then his stepladder actually took it to the point where he could physically start to practice.
And the good thing was, unlucky for us, that is what he chose to do, because what a great drummer he is.
Yeah. So Dave, we've just walked back down Hyde Park Street from Ringo's primary school, and we're back at the end of Admiral Grove, and we'll explain why in just a few moments. But let's just pick up that story. So Ringo got this interest in drumming while he was in hospital. His stepdad got him this drum kit from friends he knew down London way. There's a big leap then between just having a little practice on a few drums and getting into a band. So what happened next?
Well, one of the first jobs that Ringo got was in a local factory called Henry Hunt and Sons, which was just further down Windsor Street, still within the Dingle. And he actually was working with his next door neighbour, Eddie Miles, who lived at number 11 Admiral Grove. And he mentioned he'd got his drum kit, and Eddie was a very talented musician. So it was just a group of friends at work said, well, why don't we start a skiffle group? And that's what they did. Eddie didn't think Eddie Miles sounded quite rock and roll enough. So he comes up Eddie Clayton, which I'm not actually sure is much of an improvement on it.
Not really.
It was Elvis or something, I can get that. But yeah, so just at work they started this group, the Eddie Clayton Skiffle Group. And they would take their instruments into work and they'd play in the canteen. But that seemed to be the pattern for Ringo was the Eddie Clayton Skiffle Group became one of the top groups in Liverpool. They won competitions. And as we know, Ringo then went on to Rory Storm and the Hurricanes, who were the biggest group in Liverpool, until this other band called the Beatles come along, and Ringo's in the Beatles. So he always seemed to be in the top groups, and that's more than a coincidence. Yeah, so that they started this group, this little skiffle group, down at work. And of course, Ringo couldn't rehearse at home, as you were saying, because you're next door to each other. You can't be banging drums away at all times. And he never liked playing on his own. He wouldn't mind sort of playing along to a record, but his thing was playing in his group. So yeah, they had fun. So the Eddie Clayton Skiffle Group was his first group, and they were a really good group. And I was fortunate for my most recent book, Finding the Fourth Beatle, tracked down Roy Trafford, who was in the Eddie Clayton Skiffle Group and is still a good friend of Ringo. I got some amazing stories from him, what Richie, as he calls him, was like as a guy, and to be in the band. There's some fabulous stories.
So how long were the Eddie Clayton Skiffle Group together?
Oh, they were kept going for quite a few years, until I think it was when Eddie got married and it was time to settle down. That was sort of the end of the group. But Ringo then moved on to another skiffle group called the Darktown Skiffle Group, who again were one of the top skiffle groups in Liverpool. And one of those little known facts, when I was doing the research, my second book, The Fab 104, I found out that he was then in another group called the Cadillacs. Now, I hadn't come across this one before, but this was from an interview that Ringo had given years and years ago. So before he got to Rory Storm and the Hurricanes, he was in a group called the Cadillacs. And what we think happened was the Darktown Skiffle Group, like most skiffle groups did, they became rock and roll groups, so they changed their names. I think the Darktown Skiffle Group became the Cadillacs. So he played with them for a while before then joining Rory Storm and the Hurricanes.
That's fascinating, because a lot of people, you know, those who don't know the backstory to them, you know, assume that Ringo really just shot to fame when he came into the Beatles in August of 1962. But actually, as you were saying, Dave, he was playing with very, very good groups and top groups in the city right from the very start, really. Well,
he was, and I think one of the advantages, and obviously this will be for a future show when we talk about that change from Pete Best to Ringo, one of the great advantages that Ringo had was because he'd started in skiffle back in '57 and had gone through these different groups who were playing different types of venues, you know, especially like with Rory Storm and the Hurricanes, who were playing at Butlins. So you've got to have a great variety of songs to be playing. So he learned all these different styles of music while playing with these other groups. Once he got into the Beatles in the summer of '62, he had a totally different skill set to the one that Pete Best had and to what the Beatles were doing in the past, which made him ideally suited to be part of a group that was a recording band.
Yeah, I see what you mean. Now, we said we've come back down to the end of Admiral Grove. We're standing outside what is now a madrasa. But what was here before, and what was its connection with Ringo?
It was my favourite sweet shop.
No, really?
Oh, yeah, it was a brilliant sweet shop. You know, the old-fashioned ones got all the jars of sweets up on the shelves, and you could choose what. Sorry, I'm sorry, I'm getting lost in my
You were
memory.
back then, weren't you?
I went back there. Oh my goodness. But it was a sweet shop and newsagent shop where Ringo had a job.
Now, was this before or after he went to work at Hunt's?
This was before and during. So it was like a bit of spare pocket money and stuff, because because of the connections with here, and Ringo, like a lot of people, didn't have a house phone. When they were then the Eddie Clayton Skiffle Group and looking for bookings, the number they gave to contact was the number of the sweet shop. so that's quite handy. So it's like his office was at the top of the road.
Yeah, so his first office was a sweet shop.
Absolutely. Sounds perfect to me.
That's fascinating. Obviously the sweet shop's no longer here, it's long gone, sad to say, but fascinating though, because we're going to listen very shortly to one of Ringo's songs, aren't we, and put it into the context of this area, because you've already referenced a couple of places. Just explain the song and the references, Dave.
Well, Ringo decided that he was never going to do a book of his story. So what he's been doing over the last 10 years or so is on each album putting a song on there which tells part of his life story. So, and this started with 2008 when he brought out an album which he called Liverpool 8 and a song called Liverpool 8. And for those who don't know the reference, the postcode or zip code, as is America, for the Dingle area is L8, Liverpool 8. And so his song was all about his childhood. So he talks about, saying goodbye to Madryn Street, and later in the song he references saying goodbye to Admiral Grove. So he was looking back at the places where he lived, but he also mentions his jobs. So his first one was saying he sailed to sea. Now, not many people maybe realise this, but one of Ringo's first jobs was to work on a ferry ship that went from Liverpool round North Wales and back again. He lost that job after an altercation with his manager.
What was he doing, Dave?
He wasn't happy with how he was being treated and spoken to and stuff. So, yeah, he had an argument with his boss, which got him fired. So, yeah, there you go. Start feisty. That's how we like him. But then the other song to reference as well is, we were talking before about the living conditions and having no bathroom and no toilet in the house. His next album, he did a song called The Other Side of Liverpool, which was interesting, and one of the lines which we tried to explain was, I had to go to Stebble Street just to take a bath. Well, Stebble Street was about a quarter of a mile from his house here at Madryn Street and Admiral Grove, and because there was no bath in the house, your two options were, I mentioned before, you could jump in the tin bath. Your second option was to go to a public bathhouse, and Liverpool was the first city to bring this in to help combat some of those terrible diseases of the Victorian ages. So you could go to Stebble Street, which had public baths and a swimming pool there as well. You pay a couple of pennies and you could have a hot bath. So that's what that reference was. I had to go to Stebble Street just to take a bath. And that's why in Liverpool in particular, when we go to a swimming pool, we never say we're going to the swimming pool. We still say we're going to the baths. And that at Stebble Street is where I learned to swim as well.
Not in a bath though.
No. Yeah, no, I was a little bit better than a bath. I could cope with more than that. But I think as George Harrison did once remark to Brian Epstein about Paul being late, and Brian was saying, Paul's still in the bath, he's going to be very late, and George said, yes, but pretty clean. Well, yes, we were very clean here in the Dingle.
And it's interesting you should say that Ringo decided to tell his story through song, because also at the end of Admiral Grove, we're standing by a pub, aren't we? Which for those people who've got Ringo's solo albums will be very familiar. Tell us about that.
Yeah, well, his first solo album was Sentimental Journey. And if you've listened to the album, you'll probably agree with me that the best thing about the album is the cover. But if you look it up again, if you see the YouTube version of the podcast we're putting up, we're going to do various pictures. And the cover to Sentimental Journey was the Empress Pub. And that's the pub that stands at the top of Admiral Grove. Some people think this is where Elsie worked. It wasn't. She worked in a couple of other pubs, but not this one. But he was recording all the songs that he remembered them singing in his local pub. So I think Sentimental Journey is a Doris Day song.
Yeah.
So the photo of the cover literally was taken just from the other side of Hyde Park Street, and it's the whole of the Empress Pub but just to the right hand side of that is Admiral Grove, where he lived, and you can just see his house in the picture there. Then if you study the cover closely, you'll see, yeah, they've superimposed Ringo into the doorway. Didn't quite have Photoshop back then, so it's not quite as good. But what many people maybe don't realise, in the downstairs window, if you look carefully, there's his mum Elsie and his stepdad Harry right next to her in that front window, and the other windows are filled with their other friends and family. So again, as well as doing his more recent songs, his first solo album, he was still thinking of Admiral Grove and the Dingle.
So Dave, we started this little podcast in Madryn Street, where Ringo was born, and we are going to post photographs so people can see what Madryn Street was like and is like today. And for those people who either maybe visited Liverpool or just looking for the first time at the photographs, they might be a little bit shocked. Tell us about Madryn Street over the last 15 years or so.
Yeah, it's had interesting history. Way back when we had a Labour government in under Tony Blair, John Prescott was heading up a new campaign, which is New Heartlands Initiative, and the idea was to take some of this old Victorian working class housing in the major cities, and the idea was to demolish all the houses and build brand new ones. It never quite got off the ground, and then I've lost track of how many governments we've had since then. But it run out of money, things change. But of course that meant that one of the houses they were planning to knock down was Ringo's birthplace at 9 Madryn Street. And so a few years ago, there was 4 of us, Chris Johnson from Mercury Press, our late good friend Phil Capel, Steve Barnes and myself. We set up a campaign called Save Madryn Street, because we thought you cannot tear down Ringo Starr's birthplace. It is ridiculous. And so this battle started. They moved all the people out of Madryn and all the other streets around here, and then it just sort of got left because there was no money, and we were saying, come on, you've got to do something with this. Year after year there's nothing happening. People looking at some of the photos may think, oh, that's a new design. Instead of windows they've got sheet metal. I wonder if that will catch on. But unfortunately the houses, these have been empty for far too long, and so we started this campaign and said we've got to save Ringo's birthplace. It's a nonsense. So I was then contacted by a Save English Heritage group, and they look around at the whole of Britain and try and save important buildings and things like this. So we worked together to put the campaign, and it ended up with a government inquiry, because the Liverpool City Council still wanted to demolish all the houses, which we were opposing. But then national government stepped in and they said, okay, we'll go to an inquiry. So they held an inquiry here in Liverpool, and I was asked to go along representing Beatles fans everywhere. It was quite a responsibility, and just put our case, which was, come on, you can't pull down Ringo Starr's birthplace. He's one of the Beatles. The good news was the campaign was successful, and Ringo's birthplace was saved. And they stated in it, it's one for the architectural importance of Owens the builder. It's a very good example of his architecture, which it'd be a shame to lose. So the local authority then came up with a different idea, which would be to save a few houses at the top, demolish the rest. But again, the government inquiry said, no, you lose the context there. You've got to have the house, you've got to have it there, you've got to have at least that side of the street being maintained. So, because tourism is so important for us, you've got to show the context to all the visitors. So thankfully, because we won the campaign, instead of demolishing all the houses, they're renovating them, because these are well-built houses from the Victorian ages, and they've started with some of the houses and some of the streets further down, and they're absolutely fabulous because they've been renovating them. They look brilliant. So again, we'll post all these photos on our YouTube thing, because it just looks so good. So yeah, it was just my little bit of saying, yeah, this is my area too, this is my childhood. But that didn't matter. You just cannot pull down Ringo Starr's birthplace. So thankfully it has been saved. So if anybody was wondering, and I still get asked it all the time, yeah, that is going to be renovated. I'm not sure what they do with it after that, but his house will always be there.
Because the specialist company that they brought in, I mean, and the roads that they have completed and where people are moved into, they're absolutely fabulous, aren't they? They really are.
Yeah, they're wonderful. And when we show you the photos, you'll see what Madryn Street looks like now. But then we'll show you what the other streets are starting to look like now, and they look wonderful.
Yeah, I mean, well done to you and to the others involved in the campaign, because at the end of the day, you know, we talk about places which have been lost to history, and potentially, you know, the birthplace of a Beatle could have been one of those places. But now the great news is it's going to be kept. As you say, we don't know exactly what's going to happen with that particular house, but the important thing is it's not going to be demolished. And within about, I would suggest, I don't know, 6-9 months, Ringo's Road, Madryn Street, will be lived in once again as it would have been when he was living around here as a boy.
Yeah, and so they do look so good. And it'd be nice, because, you know, tourism is so important to Liverpool. We're getting hundreds of thousands of visitors every year. You've got to be able to show them where the Beatles were from. So we'll keep you updated with progress on that as well, because it's going to look really nice.
This is Liddypod, Beatles banter with Bedford and Beesley.
So there we are, Dave. A little potted history of Ringo's childhood growing up in the Dingle. The two houses he lived at, the school he went to, the primary school, the sweet shop he worked at, and the pub that featured on the album cover of Sentimental Journey. But you were saying to me when we were out and about, Dave, that actually there are quite a number of connections with the band, with the Dingle.
Yeah, a lot of people think that the Dingle is just about Ringo, but it's not. First of all, for John's family, John's father, Alf, was born less than half a mile from where Ringo was born, in Copperfield Street. And as we mentioned, Alf had gone to St Silas School when he was a kid. So Alf and his family were all from the Dingle. But also on John's mum's side, his Aunt Mimi, now of course she was the posh one who looked down on Alf. She was born less than quarter of a mile away from Alf in the Dingle. And something she didn't really like to mention was the fact that she was born out of wedlock. So many years later, when Mimi looked down on her sister Julia for having 2 children outside of marriage, it's actually where Mimi had come from as well. So John's mum, Julia, she was born in Head Street in the Dingle. All the 5 Stanley sisters were born there. They then moved out to Newcastle Road in Penny Lane. So John's got some very strong roots in the Dingle. For Paul, he had an auntie who lived in Vola Street, which is only a couple of streets down from Madryn Street, where Ringo was born. And that's one of the first streets to be redeveloped, so it looks really nice there. That was his Uncle Wilf and his Auntie Madge. So Paul was coming down to the Dingle. The other connection for Paul was his good school friend Ian James. Ian lived down in what we know as the Bread Street, Elswick Street, looking over the River Mersey. Paul would go back to Ian's house after school. That's where he learned to play guitar. And it was Ian's guitar that Paul first learned to play on. So Paul was coming to the Dingle all the time as well. For George, his parents got married in the registry office by Toxteth Town Hall on High Park Street, just along the road from St Silas and the Empress. So George's family have roots there. And in fact, one of George's grandparents, his grandfather, was helping in the construction of the houses on Princess Avenue. So actually, when you put it all together, the Dingle actually has the roots for all of the Fab Four.
That's amazing, that, because if you do, the Magical Mystery Tour or any tour, Ringo's is probably the first area that you'll visit because it's the closest one to the city centre. And you sort of pass through that, don't you? Okay, that's Ringo done and dusted. Let's move on to the other places. But actually, you're passing by an area that played such an integral part in the story. Absolutely,
yeah. So it's important, and that's one of those lovely things that I've been spending like the last 18 years doing this research, particularly around Liverpool. And it's trying to connect the dots and thinking, why was each area important to all of them? And the fact that, particularly with John, Paul and George, everything with their childhood is in this very small area within South Liverpool. And we used to think it was, well, John, Paul and George were around Penny Lane and the Allerton Woolton area, and Ringo was all the way down in the Dingle. But actually, this closes the gap to say they were all connected with this whole part of South Liverpool.
That's incredible, absolutely incredible, and really good to hear. And maybe we'll cover this place in a future episode, because not very far away from where we were today was actually the place where John and his band played for what we think is the very first time, isn't it?
Well, it's the very first time they were photographed in Rosebery Street, 22nd of June 1957. So those very first photos taken by Charlie Roberts. And what we'll do is we'll get Charlie in, and he can tell us about the day taking those photos. And he's got some great stories to tell, because he was hanging around with the Quarrymen. He was a good friend of Colin Hanson. But those first photos of John and the Quarrymen on the backs of those wagons, celebrating Liverpool's 750th birthday. So they're historic photos. And Charlie, it's the first time he'd really taken photos. And that's where they were, again, just down near the Dingle, coming into that Toxteth area that we talk about, that part known as Granby. So there's all these connections all the way through the different parts of Liverpool. And that's what we really want to explore with these podcasts, is say there's more to the Liverpool than just the houses, Penny Lane and Strawberry Field.
So Dave, this whole episode, as we said right from the outset, is focused on Ringo. We've looked at his childhood, we looked at the places where he grew up, the type of upbringing that he had, the trials and tribulations he went through with his health, etc. But tell us a bit more about Ringo as a drummer.
I think one of the problems has been that because Ringo, particularly in '64 when he went to America, and his sense of humour really came through, everybody sort of fell in love with him. He was sort of the clown. And in a way, his contribution to the Beatles sound has sort of been played down and not taken as seriously, and saying, well, anybody could have done it. So what happened was, when I did my second book, The Fab 104, I was highlighting all the different musicians who played a part in the Beatles story in that early part up to the end of '62. And a friend of mine, Gary Popper, who produced the Looking for Lennon film, he got the book, got in touch with me and said, I've never heard of half of these people, but do you realise you've highlighted the fact there were 12 drummers up to the end of 1962? Nobody ever talks about the drummers. So we said, well, let's write a book about the drummers. So we thought, yeah, okay, we'll do this. We'll tell the drummer's story and we'll call it 12 Drummers Drumming. And we thought, perfect title. Started work, and then, of course, I found a 13th. And that sort of destroyed that bit. And then the number just kept creeping up and up and up. And we were just about ready to go to print. How many did we have? We had 20. We had 20 drummers. And then I found 3 more. So I cause chaos wherever I go. And Gary said to me, stop going around digging up drummers, please. So we stopped at 23. But the focus, when we were thinking, okay, we need a new title. And there seems to be all the crisis points in Beatles history seem to be revolving around them getting a drummer. Because we know from the end of 1957, John, Paul and George are together. And it's always about, and this is something Neil Aspinall said, the Beatles story is always about John, Paul and George and a drummer. And he went through so many different drummers to find the one that lasted the course. And that was Ringo. So why? Was he just a lucky man? And a lot of people say that. No, he was just there, right guy at the right time. So we want to look at, why did he get the gig? How did he get it? And then, was it worth getting him in? Why did he last? And so I thought, the 2 main drummers in the Beatles story are Pete Best and Ringo Starr. Pete Best, firstly, gets a lot of bad press. And we'll deal with that in a future programme. But Ringo also gets a lot of criticism. I thought, that doesn't seem fair, but is it justified? And one thing we found out this morning was that you and I both are well-experienced drummers, aren't we?
We are, in a very different way to Ringo Starr.
Yes, and the fact that both of us in our youth played a single drum, marching drum in the Boys Brigade.
That's right. And for those people who don't know the Boys Brigade, because they're not from the United Kingdom, it's an organisation that still exists, isn't it? It's been going for over 100 years, well over 100 years now. And it's a Christian organisation for boys, and lots of Boys Brigade companies would have a band. And as it turned out, both of us played the side drum.
Yeah.
So there we go. We're both drummers in very different ways.
In very different ways. And I was actually brought out of retirement just over a week ago. For the first time, I'd played the drum in 30 years. We did a 10-minute parade around the village of Woolton. And I got to admit, it was great fun. It all came flooding back.
Yeah.
But yeah, I'm not a proper drummer. And then that's the thing. So when we were sitting down and we were thinking, we're doing this book about drummers. How can I actually write about Ringo as a drummer? Now, I've played in bands since I was in my teens. I've played with a variety of drummers of all talents, he says diplomatically. So I know a bad drummer very, very quickly. In a band, if your drummer can't play drums, you know very, very quickly. If you find the right one, you're made. But I needed more than that. So I thought, well, how can we actually say whether Ringo was or wasn't a good drummer? And the only way to do that was to go to drummers. And so I think in total we've used 9 different drummers of different ages, experiences, of backgrounds, and try to get them to say to us, actually, Ringo's a great drummer because... And what I did was, and I recommend this to any Beatles fan, is go back and listen to all the Beatles albums in order and listen for the drumming. Don't go listen for anything else. Listen for the drumming. Suddenly you start hearing things. The one I absolutely love, listen to Rory Feels Forever, and listen to Ringo's drumming in that. It's absolutely phenomenal. So we got all these different drummers and said, why does Ringo play differently? Now, we've seen with his induction to the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame, some of the world's top drummers all coming out and saying, Ringo was the guy. Now, were they saying that just to be nice? No. They were actually qualifying. He was the first guy to be doing this. He was the king of cool. He could play the song. I think, how do you explain that? So one of the first guys I spoke to was Rob Shanahan. He's been Ringo's photographer for years, but he's also a drummer. Ironically, plays in a Rolling Stones tribute band, not a Beatles tribute band. But what Rob had in common with Ringo is that they're both naturally left-handed, but play on a right-handed kit. Now, by doing that, the way the drummer plays around the kit changes completely, because you lead with your left hand. So Ringo would go round the kit, if he's trying to do a fill around the toms and the cymbals, from the opposite direction to a right-handed drummer. That changes on the timing and how you use the kit. So automatically Ringo's sound is different, but he has this ability to play the song. And I heard that phrase so many times, said, yes, but what does that mean? Please somebody tell me what that means. What it means is, because he wasn't taught to read and write music, he plays by feel. And apparently this is not a common gift. It takes a certain talent. And I found this out by interviewing drummers who played in Beatles tribute bands. They had to learn Ringo's parts. And they say it's not easy, because you listen to a song and there's like a little fill in there, and you think, okay, I've got that sorted. That's how Ringo does it. 3/4 of the way through the song, where the same fill should appear, Ringo's doing something different, because by then he thought something else would fit in. So he's a nightmare to try and learn, because he wouldn't, like a session drummer would do. He doesn't play the exact same drum pattern all the way through a song. And he said in interviews, whatever he was feeling at that time when they recorded the song, that's what he played. So you could have 30 different takes. Each one would be different, depending on what he was feeling at the time. That was a completely different way of drumming to how it had been done before, because most of the music he'd grown up listening to was sort of the jazz, the big band type of sound, which is all, yes, it could be syncopated, yes, it could be free a little bit, but it's still quite regular. He didn't play like that. And he really was the first drummer in a band to be doing something different. So other drummers wanted to play like him, and it opened up the doors to all these other bands that came along and thought, yeah, let's just do what we want to do. And so he became a very unique drummer. Now that's like a very, very quick overview. And we've gone into quite a bit of depth into defining the fourth Beatle, because very few people have really given Ringo the credit he deserves for the drumming that he did. He's very much part of that sound. And that's why we called the book Finding the Fourth Beatle. Because we had John, Paul and George. He was the fourth one. And he was just perfect for that recording career. So go back, listen to the Beatles songs and listen for the drumming. And it's amazing what you'll hear. Because, yeah, he was the guy. He fitted in. And you've got to do that as musicians.
So he was in the right place at the right time, but he was the right person as well.
That's the key thing. And one of the things that a lot of people get sort of tied up with is what happened in the summer of 62. This will be a separate programme in its own thing of replacing Pete Best and get Ringo in. And finally we have managed to solve all of that issue. And yes, factually, Ringo was not the first drummer to be approached. He was one of 4 drummers to be asked. The other 3 said no. Ringo said yes. Now, before everybody gets too excited, I'm saying, oh, no, what a disaster and stuff, you can't say that. You can, but in the end, my response is, I don't care. As a historian, I want to get the facts right. But, as you say, the key thing is, Ringo was the one who said yes. And as always seemed to happen in Beatles history, everything fell into place with the right people at the right time. At that time, he was the right person. And you can't really see it working the same way with any other drummer. So, yes, we've got the history right. We've got it in order, how it all happened. But the key thing is, Ringo was the guy who said yes. But he proved it. He was the perfect fourth Beatle.
Brilliant. Dave, we could talk about Ringo for a long, long time, but we've got to bring this episode of Liddypod to a close. Before we do, though, just tell us what we're going to be doing for the next one. It's going to be a special, the next one, isn't it?
Oh yes, it's going to be even more anarchic than this has been so far. It's coming up for Christmas. Come on, we've got to do something Christmassy, haven't we?
We have.
And so we're going to have a look at why the Beatles were so mad at Christmas. Those wonderful flexi discs that they did, those little broadcasts, those snippets they put out to the Beatles fans, it's fabulous. So we're going to have a little tribute to the madness that was the Beatles at Christmas, and we'll have some fun with it.
I'm looking forward to that myself. That's great. So you've been listening to Liddypod, Beatles banter with Bedford and Beesley, Dave Bedford, Paul Beesley, bringing our second episode to a close, all about Ringo Starr and his young childhood here in Liverpool, and some great insight there. And what a great Christmas present, let me just say, Dave. Finding the fourth Beatle is a great Christmas present. Get it from all good online stores.
Yeah, have a good look. Come to our website, it's thefourthbeatle.com. We've got limited edition there, or you can have the standard editions, which are available on Amazon as well. So just look for Finding the Fourth Beatle and you will find it.
A great Christmas present, and Christmas will be the subject of the next episode of Liddypod, Beatles banter with Bedford and Beesley.
Bye-bye.
You've been listening to Liddypod, Beatles banter with Bedford and Beesley.